Mike. Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, everyone. I have the pleasure of getting to introduce Mike and the discussion today about the book launch for today. I was incredibly excited when Ramsey Margolis, who's one of the publishers for the book, first described to me the idea or the theory of this book as being a discussion both of secular Buddhist thinking, but also left-wing democratic socialist or progressive activism. And for me, it was so exciting because it was like two different parts of my life that ordinarily had no connection with each other. It was like two completely different hobbies or interests, and then suddenly finding them together. It's a bit like, I thought about it as like a bit like when your workmates meet a family member or something like that. These different parts of your life coming together. And it was so exciting as well to hear that Mike would be the one writing it, because I've admired Mike's work, his work, both in his work in sort of thinking about democratic socialist and Marxist thinking, but also all of his commitment to secular Buddhism as well. I think as well, when we're looking at the big picture for the global secular Buddhist movement, very few people have done as much as Mike in terms of helping to connect different countries together. Certainly for my Sangha here in Wellington, New Zealand, there's very few other resources that we rely on besides the material provided in the Secular Buddhist Network. So it really helps us for our weekly meetings. I wanted to speak a little bit about the book itself. So Buddhist meditators and progressive political activists, I think in my view, really interact. Activists may dismiss Buddhism as perhaps irrelevant in the face of struggles for urgent political change, an urgency that I think over the last week has become even more urgent as well. And while many Buddhist meditators believe that activists fail to recognize that human suffering arises not simply from unjust social institutions, but also from our own human tendencies towards greed, anger, and delusion, whether those are innate or whether they come from our environment or are imposed on us by our upbringing. In Mindful Solidarity, Mike encourages political activists and Buddhist practitioners to connect with and to learn from each other. He argues that the secular form of Buddhism and democratic socialist politics, they really complement each other. And he argues that we need to pursue both individual and social transformation. Political activists with a meditation practice and imbued with that ethic of care can play a vital role as we work to create fundamental social change. And at the same time, the Buddhist path of individual transformation is enriched by making it more ethically and socially focused. In our discussion today, Winton Higgins is going to be going through, speaking to ask some questions of Mike after Mike's given a bit of an explanation of the book and a discussion. I just wanted to note as well, Winton, a huge amount of admiration that we've got for his work as well, and thinking about left-wing politics and political ideas. Again, I've gone through and forwarded a number of articles that he's written over the years and thinking about left-wing theory. And his most recent book, which I think was Revamp, had some amazing discussions of thinking about Buddhist thinking and how that connects in with left-wing politics. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I'm going to pass it over to Mike to talk about the book some more.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alex. Actually, before I give you all a brief kind of overview of the book, I just want to turn it over to Karsten Stroll, who is someone that I've worked very closely with in the United States, is within the Secular Buddhist Network, and to try to develop both secular Buddhism, but also a kind of politically engaged dimension to it. So Karsten, if you could say a few words about what we're doing with the Secular Buddhist Network.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I just want to mention at the outset that I first met Mike because both of us were interested in Marxist politics and in Buddhism, and they were like two totally different hats. And finding a comrade who would do both was really quite wonderful for me. And since that time, I've been involved with Mike and a number of others in the Secular Buddhist Network. And we have a subgroup, a socially engaged subgroup. And Mike and several of us have also started a group called Secular Dharma and Political Action. And I just want to say that a number of us have been working on this, and Mike has really been spearheading the move to bring together in real practice Buddhism and Buddhist modalities with political action and ways of understanding what we are up against socially, politically.
Thank you, Carson. Well, again, welcome everybody. And first, before I talk about the book a little bit, I do want to acknowledge Winton Higgins and Ramsey Margolis from Sufri, the secular Buddhist imprint. And they were really helpful for me in having me take a lot of material that I had written over the years, articles and essays, and sort of, forcing me to kind of think about, well, what is this book really about? Who's it for, right? What's the intention here in writing this book? And I think that was extremely helpful for me because what it has really come to, and what the book, what I want the book to do is really to stimulate a dialogue between people in the Buddhist community, secular Buddhists, but other Buddhists as well, and those who are politically engaged. And I really enjoyed hearing Alex's comment about feeling like there are these two separate worlds there. I think there are very few people who are involved in both worlds at the same time. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to really say, hey, there are valuable perspectives that come from certain aspects of Buddhism, and there's some really valuable perspectives that come from radical theory and collective political action, and that we need to really have these two things be in dialogue with each other. Now, I also just want to say, that I present a certain perspective in the book, and I think it's a worthwhile perspective, but I do totally understand that it comes from the kind of life experiences that I've had and the perspectives that mean a lot to me. So I do not in any way intend this to be a kind of, I'm providing some definitive answer to these issues. I mean, instead, what I'm really trying to do is start a conversation and have people think about these issues and have a kind of ongoing conversation. And, I think particularly now in the United States with the election of Trump and Republican control of the House and Senate, it becomes even more important to try to think about how we can develop perspective and practice that can respond to the challenges that we face. I know it's not just in the United States, obviously, but in other parts of the world as well. So as I said, I'm kind of in this book, I'm looking to bring two kind of communities and two perspectives together, and I'm sort of communicating with both. So if I'm directing my perspective or my arguments to those who are in the labor and political activist community, which, by the way, I've been involved with since the early 1970s, it's kind of a lifelong commitment on my part for that. What I'm arguing to them is that, if we want to achieve the kind of social transformations that we care about, if we want a more just and egalitarian society, we want people to have the kind of the material supports and opportunities to really flourish in their life, we need to recognize that that there are certain core Buddhist insights that are really essential for helping us as political activists be more effective and sustain ourselves in the long term. And just to shorthand this now before the discussion with Winton, I would say, mindfulness, the ethical values of care and compassion, and a kind of understanding of how as we as human beings can really trip ourselves up and cause ourselves suffering, irrespective of the kind of social conditions that we are in. And so to those in the political and activist community, I'm saying, we need to take this in. We need to internalize this in our political practice and in our perspectives, because we already face enough difficulties with neoliberal capitalism and structural racism and so forth. You know, if unless we have a kind of stronger set of internal resources and understandings, we're not going to be successful politically. We have no chance. And then on the other side, to those who are meditators and people in the Buddhist community, I'm saying to them, look, you know, the suffering that people have and the obstacles to flourishing are not just the fact that we as individuals have an unskillful relationship to ourselves and other people and to the world. Yes, that is certainly the case. But if we are kind of overly focused on individual meditation, and thinking that that's going to be the solution to our problems, that is just not the case, because in fact, a lot of our suffering does have social sources, and that has to be taken into account. And then I also say to them, this is wearing my secular Buddhist hat, that I try to make the argument that a secular Buddhist perspective actually is a better fit with efforts to try to reduce suffering and promote human flourishing, because secular Buddhists are concerned about our experience in this life and wanting to make this life better. So that is kind of the basic thrust of the book. And I'll just say that in the first couple of chapters, what I try to do is actually develop the perspective that integrates both these communities and sort of dimensions. And I call this secular radically engaged Buddhism. And I, you know, kind of try to, in presenting that perspective, try to show the dialogue between radical theory and practice and Buddhism. And then in the middle of the book, I use that perspective to critically analyze both left politics, what I believe are some unhelpful assumptions in how left movements operate, but also look at some core Buddhist notions, including meditation, not self, bodhisattva path. And then finally, at the end of the book, I turn to the issue of what human flourishing is. And that, in some sense, the reduction of suffering and the promotion of human flourishing are the goals of both radical theory and practice, you know, what I would call a non-deterministic humanistic Marxism, and also Buddhism. And I try to develop what I think is a more comprehensive notion of flourishing, which incorporates Buddha, Aristotle, Marx, and also an American philosopher named Martha Nussbaum, I think has written really valuable things about human flourishing. And in the final part of the book, I lay out what I call the 5 core tasks for someone who is committed to this kind of path of both individual and social transformation. It was really taken, and by the way, I want to credit Karsten Stroll and Katja Ducat, who I've worked closely with in the United States. We actually wrote an article on this, and what I did was really take that article and kind of build it out and develop it. And it's really, we're kind of using Stephen Batchelor's 4 tasks, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, as kind of the foundation, but we're in some sense going beyond it and revising it to include an explicitly political activist dimension, which I think is, you know, implicit in Stephen's work, but certainly not discussed in detail or explicitly. And also to really identify the social sources of suffering in more detail. So that's, I end up, again, with an invitation for people to consider this. And I do see that some form of this kind of perspective, along with other perspectives, I don't believe that somehow secular radically engaged Buddhism is the answer. I think there are probably a number of related liberatory perspectives that can contribute to a better society and a better life for individuals. So stop there. Turn it over to Winton. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Carsten and Alex, also for your introductions. I really want to congratulate you, Mike, on a great book. I mean, I think it's going to be a central text in, when we manage to get these two traditions to converge on specific issues that are on today, like climate, like gender equality, and so on. One of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about this book is that you really are swimming against the stream, to take a term from the canon, from the Pali canon. That first of in two ways. One is that there is no political discussion or theory or pointers in the Pali canon, in where the beginning of the Buddhist tradition, and that was for a very good reason. Was that what caused suffering and gross suffering and loss of life and so on 2,500 years ago were natural phenomena, things like famine, drought, flood, epidemics, and crop failures, and also the unbelievable ambient violence of the ancient world, something that Steven Pinker has pointed out in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And so there was absolutely no reason why someone looking at the causes of human suffering, which is a central issue in Buddhism, would be looking at political issues, because there was no way politics had any efficacy against these things. But now, just an awful lot of the suffering in the world is caused by government and corporate decision making. Whether we're looking at wars, genocides, the way pharmaceuticals aren't properly made available to vast majority of the human race, and the enormous inequalities that are growing as a result of 40 years of neoliberal capitalism, as you point out. So these are all sources of suffering that really prompt us to express our Buddhist ethics in a political way. And so you're running against the stream in that way, that a lot of very traditionalist Buddhists would say, well, our tradition has nothing to do with politics. It is too noble and high and above all that stuff. and that's one of the reasons. Another one is what's baked into the Buddhist tradition as we've received it from Asia is a practice of political abstentionism. This is partly because Buddhism is the religious tradition that has been most dependent upon monasticism, and monasticism has been particularly dependent on temporal elites, including political elites. So staying out of politics has been a virtue for many generations of religiously organized Buddhists. So we're running up against that, that kind of inhibition. So one of the questions that comes up in my mind when I read the book, and I've just reread it, having read the manuscript, some months before, was: do you have any sense of your main audience here? Are you mainly trying to draw the attention of meditators or are you mainly trying to draw the attention of social and political activists?
That's it's a very good question and a very difficult one. And Karsten is smiling too, because that's been a kind of a theme in our talks within the secular Buddhist network. I mean, what actually are we? Where do we think we can have the most impact? Look, I'm a member of an organization in the U.S. called the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest left group in the country, although it's relatively insignificant in political terms, but still has had a bit of a growing presence. And I've within that context, I have been able to reach out to some people and have found some degree of interest in the ideas of Buddhism and mindfulness. I think particularly among younger people who tend to predominate in that organization, there is, I think, a bit more interest in meditation than there certainly was when I was younger and involved in politics. So I think that's a hopeful thing. And I see also beyond the Democratic Socialists of America in various community groups, groups working around racial justice, even labor-oriented groups, that even the language about how conflicts are handled within the groups seems to be changing a little bit to kind of recognize the need to have more of an integrated view of human beings, as having feelings and vulnerabilities and people being aware of that. So I guess, Winton, I would have to say to you that my hope is probably more on the side that mindfulness and the idea of and the values of compassion and care could be introduced or could become more part of the political movements. I'm not sure about the Buddhist community as much. I think, well, first of all, the Buddhist community in the U.S., as in every other country, is split into so many different lineages and traditions. Secular Buddhism is really just one small stream within that. And I don't know, my experience with the members of the SBN community is that a few people are supportive of political engagement, but I think there's, at least in a lot of Western countries, I think most people associate Buddhism with individual meditation practice, and it's about self-help, self-care, wellness, which is fine. I mean, that's actually how I got into it myself in 2010. So I'm not dismissing that, but I don't know that there is great interest in the Buddhist community. So, I mean, I'm looking at, sure, there are people from different countries here. What your own experiences are, I don't know. I guess if I had to answer, I would say I'm probably more inclined to put my effort into the sort of political activist community. I don't know, Karsten, did you want to, you have any thoughts about that?
I would add to that your book makes a compelling case that Buddhists should become socially and even radically engaged. Mm-hmm. And so that one of the hopes that could come out of this book and the kind of work that we do in the Secular Buddhist Network and other people do is to give people a sense of motivation to do more than simply sit on the cushion. And at this particular point of time in the United States, quite a number of Buddhists are thinking, gee, I feel pretty demoralized. What do we do? And maybe this is the time to tell them, well, you should be more socially engaged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just on that, last December, Stephen Batchelor and Lenore Lambert and I ran a retreat, which was a study retreat on the basis of his rewriting of the Eightfold Path, which my comments on in the book. But in this retreat, what was interesting was overwhelmingly, of course, Buddhist meditators, Buddhist practitioners who came to the retreat. But when I suppose I was the main one who was sort of putting out little bits of political bait to see who would bite. I think I was the very first person to mention Niccolo Machiavelli favorably in a Buddhist retreat. It sort of triggered something that all these people then turned out to be actually, or a great majority of them were already active in particularly in environmental issues. And as the retreat proceeded, I mean, there was this current started, which was irresistible. Not that we wanted to resist it, where it ended up being a kind of an activist workshop. And I thought, I was quite astonished and delighted that it had this effect. So, it may well be that the book will start a prairie fire within the world of meditation, particularly helped along by recent events in American politics.
Yeah.
But you want to say something?
Well, I was to say, I'm happy if it's like a little bush burning. I don't know about a prairie fire. This is a pretty small niche of interest. But no, I mean, I actually in recent days I'm on the mailing list for a lot of different Buddhist centers, and I have noticed that been a lot of effort to do post-election meetings, retreats. In fact, we're going to do one next week, next Thursday. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all, we try to do where we try to be the most effective where we can be, and I think like for Alex, from your, wearing your two hats, that you try to bring into both, right?
Yeah,
you can.
I mean, it's certainly for like the progressive activism that I'm engaged in, which is often with the Labour Party in New Zealand. It's something which is, the two parts can sort of connect together and mutually reinforce. It's hard, I suppose, I've often thought about it, it's hard to live the fourth task, as it were, thinking about or the Eightfold Path, if you're not thinking about the wider social context that often causes suffering, or that causes reactivity, or causes people to experience distress. And I think that was something the Buddha really captured, was that concept of that it's a self-reinforcing chain. If your society is making you reactive or making you distressed, it's very hard to be able to engage in the other three tasks. And so you can't just do the first three tasks of experiencing dukkha and then seeing your reactivity arise and then seeing it pass away if the rest of your life is miserable. And I think it's that chain together, which is something that I've often reflected on.
Yeah. If I could just sort of slightly change tack now, in terms of your approach to these two currents of thought, I think you sometimes refer to them as lineages, Mike. I really like the eclecticism that you bring, and so bring in people like Martha Nussbaum. I'm also a fan, and it just seems to me that living in the 21st century, we're not going to in any way be restricted to a silo called Buddhism or one called Marxism or socialism, but we've got to draw in strands of thought that really do help us to articulate our two most fundamental loyalties here. And as you mentioned in the book, I think Freud's discussion of mourning and melancholia, for instance, has a tremendous amount to say about how we think about the suffering that Buddhism is addressing. My question is exactly how do we do this eclecticism?
Mm.
And one way that I do it, for instance, is, and I think to some extent Stephen Batchelor, is through the concept of tradition that comes out of Alistair McIntyre, where you've got two kinds of traditions: dead ones, which is ones where people who are practicing in those traditions don't know how it started, how it got going, how it developed, and therefore they don't know how to reform it, how to renovate it. So that's a dead tradition. But a living tradition is one in which we do know how it started, how it's developed, and therefore we can work with the grain of its development to bring it up to speed to address our own issues, our own problems. So given that, I mean, eclecticism has to be done rather carefully so that we are making available to ourselves people like Martha Nussbaum or Richard Rorty or John Dewey, at the same time preserving the strength of the coherence of the original tradition. And so, you know, when I looked at your chapter 8, I was beginning to feel just a little bit uneasy about can we just rewrite the Dharma, or should we be thinking more in terms of how do I work with the grain of this tradition? I'm not sure I actually disagree with anything you did there, but I was just thinking that we need to be aware of this problem. I mean, the same goes for Marx. Marx isn't such a problem because he's a modern writer, in the sense in which we think about modernity just going back to the 16th century. But the wonderful discussion, for instance, in Martin Hägglund's book, which you also reference in your own, of Marx's theories of exploitation, labour theory of value based upon labour time, and also his concept of capitalism establishing the conditions of another completely different, even reversing kind of transition to socialism. So I guess I'm just wondering how you feel about how easily or how unproblematically one can bring these other sources that which are valuable and should never be dispensed with, but how you actually meld them, to use a word you use, how do we meld them into these two major traditions that we're dealing with here, which are, say, Marxism and Buddhism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think my own personal development, intellectual development, was that I started when I was very young, and particularly in college, gravitating as part of my own political activism. I was gravitating to what I call a non-deterministic humanistic Marxism, which is only one version of Marxism, right? I mean, at the time, there were many different versions of Marxism as there is now. And but what I was interested in was the Marx who identified the capacity of human beings to change themselves and change the world because of their creative intelligence and capacity for creative labor or praxis. There are many other kinds of Marxism that could be developed, including those that would look at history as kind of in a very economic, deterministic way. And there are, of course, political interpretations that range from, those who support Stalinism to, much more democratic conceptions. I mean, as I say in the book, if someone offered, like Marx or the Buddha or Freud, if they're offering us an incredibly insightful observation and understanding of our world and us, it can be taken in many different ways. So, I mean, I think, Winton, that what we certainly want to do is have a kind of respect and certainly appreciation for the traditions that have evolved out of it. But ultimately, we have to make choices about which aspects of those traditions are most important to us and are most valuable. I rejected some aspects of Marxism when I was younger and embraced others. Now, in terms of Buddhism, and this is where I think I probably depart from Stephen Batchelor. And again, I'm not saying that I'm correct and I have the correct answer, but see, I didn't. Stephen came from a deep and has a deep engagement in Buddhist traditions. Well, he was a monk in the Tibetan tradition and then in the Korean Zen tradition. He's been trying, and I think in a wonderful way, and I give him credit for this throughout the book and my appreciation for what he's done. But he's in a sense, he's kind of renovating Buddhism through a kind of internal critique and bringing it to a different level. I didn't start, that's not where my starting point was. My starting point was political activism, labor activism, a kind of humanistic Marxism, Deweyan pragmatism, a kind of understanding the importance of psychodynamic theories, Freud and others, in terms of how it affects us. And Buddhism, for me, came quite late. So my task in terms of an eclectic, kind of bringing together was to see how certain insights of Buddhism fit in with my pre-existing views. It worked for me in terms of developing the perspective that I've presented. But I understand that, for some people, perhaps many people, they will see that as a kind of perhaps a dismissal of Buddhism. For example, just to be quite honest, the Eightfold Path, maybe it should be a 10-fold path or 12-fold path. Why 8? Right? I mean, if we're thinking about a path where we can kind of develop, transform ourselves individually and also affect society, I want to like be open about that. I want to think about what are the capacities and skills and virtues that are important for a flourishing life. And yes, maybe we certainly would reference the Eightfold Path and start with it, but we might want to add other things. So I guess in that sense, Winton, I depart a bit from Stephen, and I think you have to acknowledge that. I think you have to be honest about what you're doing in that context and say, here's where I'm standing with it. And also just, again, take the position that, here's the perspective that makes the most sense to me. Let's talk about it. What do you think? But it's a problem. I mean, I don't want a kind of an eclecticism that is simply just throwing together, sort of bits and pieces that are just cherry picked from different traditions. What I saw in common with Marxism and Buddhism what I see in common is both having a strong sense of the ethical value and the goal of having people live decent lives, right? That people suffer, that they're, in Marxist terms, they're alienated, they're exploited, and it's not right, and so let's find out why that's happening. In Marx's case, it's social systems. In the Buddhist case, it's kind of the way that we trip ourselves up through greed, hatred, and delusion. But they both want, and this is why I can embrace them both, they both want, in a universal way, people to have good lives and flourishing lives. And so that was kind of the framework in which I put them together. That was just my path. Is that helpful? Yes.
No, my experience is a bit like yours. I mean, before I had my profound experience of conversion to the Dharma in 1987, I had a equally profound conversion to Marxism in 1970 when I was a graduate student of Ralph Miliband at the London School of Economics. And if anyone could put it across it was Ralph. And I did notice with great approval that the third dedicatee of your book is Rosa Luxemburg.
Oh, see, okay. Sharon is laughing because, by the way, Sharon Tobias is my spouse who's on the call, and
Yeah.
yes, I dedicated the book to Sharon, Sarah, who's our daughter, and Rosa L. We actually have a dog whose name is Rosa, but just as a little in-family joke, it was dedicated to Rosa L. And
Right.
we assumed that nobody except those who were very familiar with the socialist movement would know who Rosa L is. So, Winton, you caught me out in a.
Well, one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read was J.P. Nettles', I think it was 3-volume biography of Rosa Luxemburg, which was absolutely extraordinary piece of passion and scholarship. It was great stuff. So that leads me, let me ask you a final question though. And this one is the question that I think we all ultimately need to stop ducking is how transition might work to a democratic socialist society. I remember after reading Martin Headland's book about where he ends up in the second half, extolling Marxism and the need for democratic socialism. And obviously he's read his Marx very, very well. But I sat down and sent him an email saying, you haven't dealt with the issue of transition, mate. What have you got to say about that? And within 24 hours, I got a reply saying, I'm working on it. Watch this space. And I'm still watching it. and it seems to be just one of those things that that democratic socialists, whether they meditate or not, really have to address. Because most of what we do as social activists is that we are trying to stop something. And because there is a lack of what some famous American politician called the vision thing, the vision thing I think is sort of important to focus people and get them in a place where they can situate what they're doing today in terms of some sort of wider historical movement that carries the possibility or even the promise of a better world. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, in the book, I was the only thing I was saying there was that when I was younger, if you asked me about the transition, I would say, oh, it's relatively simple. Workers are going to become more radical. They'll form unions. The unions will become more and more powerful. Workers will become politically conscious, and they will create the basis for socialism. And we'll have then a democratic and society controlled by workers. And it was just one path. It was, through the workers' movement. And what I say in the book, in a bit of my personal and intellectual history, is that I've come to see the idea of a transition as being much more complex and much more difficult, in fact. Partly by taking on the kind of Buddhist insights about the way we trip ourselves up and hurt ourselves. So I think that what I'm at this point inclined to believe is that while there certainly needs to be a strong and powerful labor movement that can be a strong force in challenging neoliberal capitalism, there are a lot of other components that will need to be in place, and that it will include a mix of things that involve, even in the here and now, developing in a prefigurative way forms of cooperation and collective action that can perhaps serve as examples through mutual aid or cooperatives. It will also include movements around racial justice and and against sexism. It will include the whole climate movement. The problem, of course, is how are all these things brought together, right? You talk about, eclecticism, but how do we create a kind of a movement that's multifaceted, but yet has the social weight to actually make a difference, and also the kind of vision that people can say, and this is the kind of life that we should have, that we ought to be leading. And I think so. It's not. I mean, part of the problem with current politics is that some on the left think that somehow if you offer better redistributive policies, if you tax the rich and raise wages, that somehow that's going to lead to some transition. That's clearly too limited, and I think we're going to need to have both the kind of support for material progress, but also a way in which people, I don't want to necessarily call it spiritual, but that there's a kind of deeply held values about what it means to live together that people see as a positive thing. How do we live together in a cooperative way? How do we support each other? How can we live with differences in views and perspectives and even, religious practices, but still have a coherent society? So I think that to me is the challenge, Winton, and it's not a good answer to what you posed, but I think what Buddhism does provide us in this context is a sense of open-mindedness, the kind of freshness to looking at things, seeing the complexity of things, seeing our limitations and our imperfections, and with that, be able to dialogue with each other in a way that we understand that there's no certainty here, right? There's no one way. There's no one correct line, in politics that somehow is going to solve everything, but that is going to be hopefully through a process of dialogue and communication, that we can sort of assemble the pieces in a coherent way. And look, I mean, do we know? I mean, I was talking with a good friend a couple of nights ago who I've known since college, and he traveled on the path of left activism together, thinking about Marx and so forth. And he was, very upset and disappointed about Trump's election in the United States and what's happening. He lives in France now, and what's happening in France and other countries. And he said, Mike, I'm just not sure if it's possible. Is it possible actually to have a transition, right? Just because of the humans and their capacity for hatred, for seeing other people as the other, and I don't know. I can't tell you. I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but I guess I take a kind of existential and kind of moral stance that I don't know, but I think I want to be on the side of reducing suffering and contributing to flourishing. And I don't know where it ends up. I don't know how far we get with that. And maybe we will be blocked. Maybe it's insurmountable. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm just interested, as I say in the book, in shifting the balance, in human beings from the worst qualities of us to the better angels of our nature. As Lincoln said and others have said. And I don't know how far it can be shifted, but I want to do the most that I can to see it shift as far as possible. And I think if we do that, and as more and more people do that, we have the best chance of making a transition. And that's as much as I know.
Thank you, Mike. I was thinking of Simone Weil and her statement. Even if the situation is absolutely hopeless, you've got to keep fighting because it's a question of personal integrity.
Yeah,
and but perhaps we need to open it now to questions.
Yes, and actually, Clarkson, did you have anything else before we get questions? Did you want to add anything?
I might just come back to some of the reasons that it's important for Buddhists to get involved, not just out of their own internal understanding of suffering. One way to pose it is Slavoj Žižek threw down the gauntlet recently. He says Buddhists are just apologies for neoliberalism. They think they've escaped it all, and therefore they can afford not to do anything and that's going to simply reinforce neoliberal capitalism. And somebody like John Peabody said, you know, he doesn't know a lot about Buddhism, but on the other hand, he's right about what certain people do. If he wrote in an article called "The Elephant in the Dharma Hall," and you know that the elephant in the Dharma Hall is, are we just going to sit on the cushion? And with that, there's a challenge to Buddhists. What are you doing? You're just sitting and maybe extinguishing some personal suffering, or are you going to do something else? And I think Mike's book is a very good answer to that.
Mm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I agree.
So any questions from folks or any comments? Like we've been, there's a lot that's you know, been discussed. Yeah, of course.
I'm waiting for other people, but you know, I think it's really important if you're a secular Buddhist and you start off with this is the world, and this world is not just a one-dimensional world, it has a whole history. Then we have to really pay attention to the historical forces. And that's one of the reasons that Marxism is important, because Marx has something to say about those historical forces. But beyond that, we ought to actually be willing to look at Buddhism within a full historical context, so that, for example, to mention something, Winton, that you mentioned, in the early stages of Buddhism, well, they weren't going to develop political strategy. I think it's not just that they're faced with famine and quakes and there's lots of violence. I think it's also that Buddhists needed the approval of the rulers in order to make a go of it. And we should recognize that some of the development of Buddhism was, I wouldn't say toadying to the rulers, but at least trying to abstract themselves from politics so the rulers could continue to support them. And some very interesting work on some Buddhists participated in ecological devastation in the early 500 years and so forth. And we should be willing, and we could look at the Zen people who supported the kamikaze pilots and so on and so forth. We should be really locate Buddhism historically all the way through. Negative features.
I think that's an important point. Yeah, I agree.
Mike, one of the experiences that I've had in talking to meditators or people who come along to the Sangha, and they're very comfortable with the idea, for example, of secular Buddhism, because to some extent it's not taking them outside their comfort zone, because it gives all the best things of meditation and mindfulness in Buddhism, but without having to deal with uncomfortable things like karma or reincarnation or things that they wouldn't otherwise believe. But when it comes to the question of getting involved in, say, progressive politics or activism or left-wing thinking or thinking about redistribution of wealth, suddenly for some of them, the walls will come up. Oh, no, I only wanted the good bits of that. I didn't want to have to deal with the difficult or uncomfortable parts. And in it's a contrast, I suppose, perhaps with aspects of Christianity where you might find there's parts of Christ's teachings where you can find a real line and say this is against the accumulation of wealth or inequality. If you had a minute to go through to explain to someone the Buddha's teachings that link towards that need for activism and left-wing or redistribution, what would you say in terms of the Buddha's teachings?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, for example, Bhikkhu Bodhi has a book where he looks at a number of sources within the early teachings that sort of promote community harmony and a kind of just society. But I think, you know, I think Winton's point is basically correct, that I think you can, let me put it to you this way. Certainly the Buddhist emphasis on loving kindness and compassion, the Brahma Viharas, are certainly provide a wonderful basis for looking at other people, relating to other people in the world in a way that promotes justice right? You could also, if you, in terms of Thich Nhat Hanh's approach of interbeing, or other forms of Buddhism that emphasize interconnection and interbeing are also very helpful resources in terms of developing an eco-socialist perspective and a kind of peaceful perspective. So certainly there are elements within Buddhism that are consistent with and are definitely resources. I think the problem, though, Alex, is that a lot of people in our societies, and that are controlled by neoliberal capitalism and other structures, we're unfortunately in a situation where kind of individualism and is so strong and so reinforced in people that a lot of people come to Buddhism as a kind of way of kind of protecting themselves from society and finding some peace. And so they find the bits in Buddhism that are helpful in terms of meditation practices, but they're using it in a kind of very individualistic way. And I talk about this in the book as well. And again, it's not to disparage them. It's just this is part of the way we function in our society. So it really requires, I think your point, Alex, I think that we can identify certain resources in Buddhism that are helpful in that way, but we really also need other perspectives as well. And I think that's, one of the points that I made in the book. But I see exactly the same thing that you're talking about in our secular Buddhist network, community discussions. Although there are actually a fair number of people who are trying to connect the two, but I would say the majority are, they're quite happy to have a practice that is focused on a more individual level.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge as well that Thich Nhat Hanh, the concept of interbeing has often been a real resource that we've used in One Mindful Breath in helping to be able to connect that idea that your interests and the interests of others are inherently interlinked, and that actually, that therefore action is required. It's not just a matter of avoiding craving or aversion and living in your own individual little bubble of tranquility.
I think a couple of people, if it's okay with folks, if we go a little, this was set for an hour, but is it okay if we go a little bit past, if people have their hands up? So yeah, I'll be glad to stay. Alex, do you want to call them or should I? Whichever. All right. Well, Sharon, do you want to? You had your hand up.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
All I was going to add that even on the individual level, when all is said and done, all we really have are the results of our individual actions. So that's actually that's a Buddhist principle that could lend itself to political action. No, I mean, our sense of responsibility.
Yeah,
that's all.
Yeah, thank you. I think John, you had your hand up again.
Yes, look, no, I just want to a point you just made, Mike, just a minute ago, had a resonance for me, and that was that how we get to Buddhism. And most people, and I will say I've sort of come into Buddhism when life was a little overwhelming. I wasn't looking for any way of escaping from life, but it was overwhelming. I needed to get my head above the water, and it was really great that way. It really did help me get my head above the water. And I've only just started reading your book, and I'm really enjoying it. I've just sort of, it's opening up a whole sort of a sensation for me. And that is the sense that from a Buddhist perspective, it's reminding me how important in ethics, social action is an integral part. And that wise social action, we can learn wise social actions by even looking at Marx, and that I'd never thought you could do. because I'm not a Marxist. I've come from a very strong Catholic background. But so this connection between movement of our ethics that we develop, and an integral part of our ethics is putting it into action and doing it wisely, is where I see your book sort of providing some journey, some experience at exploring. That makes sense?
Yes, and I appreciate that. Yeah, that's certainly that's one of the intents of the book. Absolutely.
Yeah, so from a Buddhist perspective, coming from that, it's sort of drawing me into Marx as a wise way of putting action. I don't know about from the Marxist point of view. Hopefully it draws them into a more compassionate form of action. And that was very clear right from the beginning in in that very first chapter or two. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
Bernard, I think you have your hand up. Yeah. And good seeing you, by the way.
Good seeing you, Mike, and Winton. Really, really good to be here. And so, yeah, just I was thinking when you were answering last question by Alex, and I'm not disagreeing with you. When we have people come to our Dharma activities seeking for this sort of individual kind of transformation, that is being a victim of the system and systemic suffering. So the fact that they're looking for this individual thing is, I mean, we're not going to go into victim blaming, but it's precisely a symptom of this. And it might be a good connection to point this out. Look, I mean, instead of just, as we usually do, and as I usually do, so I'm guilty of this, and it's something I need to think about, just point out the individual psychological roots of the distress. But if we show them, well, some of these might actually be coming as well from some structural things that might help. And another theme that I'm thinking about a lot in the last year is how much the ascetic model is still underlying the Dharma world, which puts solitary meditation at the top of the pyramid. And that's the real practice, that's deepening in practice, and anything else is second class. And it might also help, I think, if we start, as we are already doing, I think, since the pandemic, to shift a little bit this and really not emphasize the retreat center as the real place of real practice and emphasize ethics from the beginning and the end. So I would, instead of like Stephen's reordering of the pathas ending with ethics, I would put it together with a classical notion that starts with ethics, so behavior. So it's all about behavior. It ends and begins with behavior, and emphasize doing. We emphasize feeling a lot, and it's about what we feel, and feeling is usually we perceive it as being individual. So the being mode in the mindfulness world is very convenient to certain structures. That's not how it was meant to be. I mean, I've had people from the mindfulness world say, well, that's not the point, but it sounds very convenient. So we have to re-emphasize the doing mode in a way, that we're always doing stuff. I don't know if you have.
No, thank you, Bernard. And I think, you know, if you think about where the mindfulness movement expanded and became prominent was, you know, in medical areas, you know, through John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and then mindfulness-based psychotherapeutic modalities. That's where, you know, it became really prominent in our society. And, you know, again, there might be some MBSR teachers, instructors who do kind of point to the social sources of suffering, but I think that's pretty limited from what I understand. I mean, if you look at the standard course for MBSR, it really does not, as I, you know, from what I've seen, really emphasize that. So good point. Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, Sharon, and then Karsten.
I just wanted to say something regarding what Bernard just said, because I would question whether mindfulness without an ethical component is really mindfulness. You know, I mean, we don't often you know, there are so many definitions of mindfulness, but mindfulness has an ethical component by its very nature, doesn't it? Or shouldn't we present it that way? Am I
Well, that's
making any
certainly.
sense?
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I mean, that's you know, the focus of actually a group that Sharon and I are involved with, trying to develop a curriculum for an online course on mindfulness-based ethical living. And I think there are other sort of efforts along those lines. And this was really coming out of Stephen Batchelor's a series of writings and a workshop he did in Germany in 2022. So yeah, I think, and in fact, I mean, you know, the title of my book is Mindful Solidarity. So it's mindful political action and political action, which is imbued with the ethic of care and compassion. So yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. That's absolutely.
Can I just say that I think what's often missing is that in the original Satipatthana Sutta, from where all mindfulness meditation comes, but an important dimension of it is mindfulness of the process of others. It's not just one's own processes, but, you know, mindful internally and externally. And you know, it's a point made in Insight Dialogue that this is the whole underpinning of that really valuable practice is to actually be mindful of another person's processes when you're in their presence. And if they're suffering from social conditions or from racial discrimination or gender discrimination, then it's in your consciousness, and it invites an ethical response.
Well, I think we'll take one more, and unless anybody else wants to speak, we'll have Carson, and you have the final question or comment.
Just to pick up on the last, I guess the last 3 points. Mindfulness, when people think of it, is simply something that will deal with their own personal troubles, independent of anything else, isn't going to do it even on the traditional level of Buddhism. I mean, it's going to reinforce the self, and mindfulness becomes another commodity that we're going to, you know, we'll buy this mindfulness, we'll go to this retreat, we'll do this program, and then we have this nice thing which will make us feel better. And that's not going to extinguish delusion, greed, and hatred. Even without secular Buddhism. Tell people that they're not going to be enlightened that way. They've got to reach out to other people, and their actions have to make sense, and they have to be aware of the suffering of others if they're really going to be mindful. And any attempt to do anything reasonable on the path is going to involve much more than just your individual suffering. And I think that's in the traditional Buddhism.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carson. So I think I want to thank everybody for coming to this. I hope it was you know, worthwhile experience, and you know, we have recorded this, so we'll be available for others. But again, Winton, I want to thank you so much. You were really instrumental in kind of helping to usher the book through to its completion. Both in terms of thinking about the issues a little more clearly, but also, you know, your excellent editing skills. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that you do.
And Michael, thank you for writing this lovely book.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you, Carson. And Alex, thank you for the introduction.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay, everybody. Well, be well. Take care.
Yeah.